Last week, I went backpacking. Not just a short backpacking trip through a little trail, but a 3-day, 3-night adventure through the mountains in Red River Gorge. And as a diabetic, going backpacking can be a little tough, but I got some good news for you. As someone who survived it myself, it can be done. So today, I had to go over that. Today, I had to go over what it takes to backpack to go on a long hike. And I'm talking days. I'm talking spending the night in a tent under the stars multiple nights in a row. Can a diabetic do it? Yes. How do they do it? Let me show you. So first, let's talk about all the things you might need to bring in order to survive such a hiking trip as a type 1 diabetic. Most important thing you need to bring, of course, is insulin. Now, you can't go very long without insulin, especially in the wild, and there's no Walgreens in the woods, so you're going to need to bring that insulin, and you need to make sure that's stored in a way to where it's not going to be destroyed by the elements. And I'm not talking about temperature, but also, if you fall, if your back drops too hard, you want to make sure your insulin is in a good place to where it's not going to break. And you also want to make sure that your insulin is not going to get too hot or get too cold in a situation where you're backpacking in the winter or in the very hot summer. Best thing to do for this would be just a thermos. Now, thermos is used to keep soup hot, but actually you can use to keep whatever is in the thermos at the temperature that it's at. So you can get some Freon. If you're trying to keep insulin cool, you can get Freon from the store, something that sort of fills up with water and is able to keep things cool for a long time. Stuff that in a thermos with your insulin, and that insulin will stay cool for a long time. Likewise, if you're going through the winter backpacking, you can keep your insulin in a thermos and it'll be able to keep the insulin at a much warmer temperature than the harsh conditions around you. And that's very important because if insulin ever freezes, it's no good. You can't use it anymore. And it'd be a real bad situation if your insulin froze on a hike and you have 2 more days to go, right? Not a good look. So be sure to have a thermos, have some protection, not just for breaking it, but also for temperature. Another thing you want to bring is make sure you have a good meter that is fully charged. I'm not just talking about your CGM, but I mean an actual separate meter that can run a long time just on a battery, and lots of strips. You never know how many you'll need. You'll probably need more test strips than you think because your blood sugar is going to go out of whack, most likely unless you've done it many times before. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but be sure you have a lot of test strips and be sure you have a separate meter from your usual one that you can use in case, let's say, your CGM, or if you use your cell phone like I do, if that battery goes out, you make sure you have a meter you can use in that kind of situation. Another really important thing is bring a lot of glucose tabs, and I mean a lot, more than you think. Lots and lots and lots of glucose tabs. I brought double the amount of glucose tabs I thought I needed, and guess what? I used almost all of them, and I'll explain why in a minute. But seriously, bring them, because when you're on a hike, when you're doing a lot of physical activity, your insulin sensitivity shoots up, and that means your blood sugar is going to end up going down. Unless you're very used to this kind of experience, you might get a lot of lows. So be sure to have a lot of glucose tabs, or else you're not going to have a very good time. Another good idea, of course, along with glucose tabs is liquid glucose. You can either make it yourself or you can buy that at the store. Liquid glucose is especially nice for when you're already on the trail, you're already moving. That liquid glucose is going to shoot you up way faster and keep you going much quicker than a glucose tab would, although they are a little harder to measure. Another thing is I'd say bring more syringes, or if you're on a pump, more pump supplies than you think you need. Why? Well, let's say you have a pump, right? You got one of the wired ones. You're walking through the trail. There's trees all around you. A branch snags on your wire and rips it off. What are you going to do if you don't have any more pump size to inject back in there and get that tubing back? You're going to be having a really rough time. So to avoid that, make sure you pack extra pump supplies, or make sure you pack extra syringes in case any of them break or you end up using more than you think. And that way, no matter what happens, you're going to be able to get that insulin delivered to you with even in the worst case scenario, right? You want to be able to prepare for that worst case scenario. Another thing I recommend, of course, is some shelf-stable food. Now, that's easy for normal high-carb people. They can bring some granola bars, or, they can bring some dehydrated food. And there's some dehydrated food that's low carb that we can eat as well. But in general, dehydrated food tends to be very carb heavy. Even the stuff that shouldn't have carbs often does. So if you do want to go the dehydrated food route, be sure to check the carbs on that first. But some other shelf-stable foods you can bring, will pack on a little bit of weight, would be meats. Dried meats like jerky or summer sausage. You could also bring various hard cheeses, because believe it or not, hard cheese does stay good at room temperature for a long time. Stuff like that, canned goods as well can work. We want to make sure you don't go too big, because if your backpack gets too heavy, you're going to have a hard time there as well. But be sure to bring food that is going to be able to stay good for at least the few days that you're out. And that way, you're able to eat without compromising your diet, and you're able to maintain a better blood sugar than you otherwise would. Some other stuff you can bring that isn't necessarily related to diabetes, but I found really useful, were trekking poles, good shoes. Seriously, bring good shoes. I'm regretting not bringing good enough shoes. Bring a water sack and a water filter so you can refill in the creek and stuff like that. And make sure your gear is as light as you can make it, because the heavier the bag, the worse the travel is going to be for you, okay? Now, once you have all your supplies ready, what should you do to get ready? Well, the first thing I do is, once you have your meal plan figured out, once you know what you're going to bring as far as food goes, you should experiment with that food. It'd be a little rough and tumble for you to try this food for the first time, try the dosing for this food for the first time on the trail, right? It'd probably be a little better for you to give it a few tries at home first, so that way you can tinker that dose and figure out a good dose for that meal before you're out in the woods with it, right? So try the meal a few times first before you bring on your hike. Experiment with a little bit so you got those dosing numbers just right. Another thing you should practice with is your backpack. If you're backpacking, you have a tent, a sleeping bag, all your food, all sorts of stuff in there. If you are carrying a lot of weight and you're not used to hiking with a lot of weight, I would highly recommend training a little bit and getting used to that. Walking around with it, going on a small hike with it, get your body used to that kind of feeling, so that way you're not worn out by the end of your backpacking trip like I was. My legs are still sore. And most importantly, make sure you have a good handle on your diabetes first. Now, this is a given, and if you're watching this channel and you're following along with the stuff I talk about, you probably already have a good handle on your diabetes, but in case you don't, wait it out until you do. Because the worst case scenario is you end up in a coma. You end up in some extreme episode brought on by your lack of control of your diabetes. You end up having to be helicoptered out of there. Remember, ambulance is not going to reach you in the mountains, okay? It's going to be and there's a lot of places where you don't even have reception. It's going to be a real tough time for you and whoever you're with if you can't take care of yourself, and if you're prone to get into some extreme incident because of your diabetes. So make sure you have a really good handle on that. Make sure you're really confident in your numbers before you embark on such a long trip. Seriously. And if you need help with that, you can check out my series, 3 Keys to Taming Diabetes, where I go over all the steps I use to help manage my diabetes and keep it under wraps. So what are some other stuff I learned from backpacking? Well, the biggest thing I learned is that, remember I was talking about experimenting with your meal beforehand? Well, I did that myself. I had, a pound of summer sausage and some cheese every day, and that actually sustained me pretty well, and I actually trained with that for a week beforehand, multiple weeks beforehand, and I got the dosing down before the hike, but during the hike, everything changed, because my insulin sensitivity from walking with this heavy bag 8 hours a day was through the roof. And because of that, that dose needed to be way less than I thought it was supposed to be. So I ended up having to decrease that dose, following the same regimen with timing and ratio and all that, but I had to decrease that dose up to around half. And the same thing with my basal. My basal was also way too high, and I had to bring that down to, to 3/4 or to just a half of what my basal was normally. And until I did that, my blood sugar was going low constantly. I probably used around 30 glucose tabs around this entire trip because my blood sugar was going low so much because of how sensitive I was to insulin during this hike. Now, the first day, this might not be as big of a deal, but once you're a day into it, 2 days into it, that sensitivity is going to be a big deal. You're going to have to be okay with lowering that dose substantially during that time in order to avoid those lows. And speaking of those lows, don't be afraid to take breaks. Never be afraid to take a break, whether you're friends or anyone. Don't feel pressured if you're on a time crunch or what. It's okay. If you need to take a break, you feel low, test, and if you're low, eat some glucose tabs and wait a little bit before you continue. Your health is more important, your safety is more important than a few minutes it takes to sit down, relax for a second, and test your blood sugar and eat some glucose if you need to. And plus, honestly, I bet your friends will be relieved to take that break, and they can use an excuse to do it, okay? So don't be afraid to take breaks when you feel low. Sit down, relax, take that glucose, take the time you need to get back in action, and avoid doing any sort of strenuous activity like that when you're low. One last thing I'd say is know your limits. Know your limits. Honestly, I didn't know my limits. This is my first time ever backpacking, and ever backpacking for 3 or 4 days on top of that, right? And as a result, I got through it. I'm alive, but as a result, my legs are still sore a week later. So know your limits, train ahead of time, get your body more used to it, and make sure you don't end up being a burden for someone else because of your diabetes or because of anything else. So keep all those backpacking tips in mind. Be sure to stay safe. Be sure to be careful. Be sure to have confidence in your numbers, in your diabetes before you take such an extreme venture. And be sure to go with a buddy. Be sure to go with a friend or 2 or 3 that can help keep you on track and that can help you deal with your blood sugars if they get too out of whack. That's all I have, everyone. Keep taming that type 1. Enjoy your backpacking this summer, and I'll see you next time. What's up, guys? If you liked that video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, be sure to subscribe, and be sure to share the video with your friends so that way the world can find out what it truly takes to tame type 1. Along with that, be sure to check out my website, tametype1.com, where you can find testimonials, where you can find more tips and tricks, and you can even sign up for type 1 diabetic coaching. Along with that, if you aren't on them yet, please follow me on my social media platforms, and not just Facebook, YouTube, but also Gab, Rumble, Telegram, and Odyssey. We never know when the censorship overlords and big tech are going to come for me next, being a truth teller when it comes to health, so be sure to follow these platforms, and that way, no matter what happens, you'll always be able to follow us and you'll always learn the next new tips in taming type 1 diabetes. Follow along, everyone, keep updated, share the video, and learn what it takes to tame type 1. I'll see y'all next time.